Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom with Bob Olson, who will now introduce today's show and speaker.
WCAT Radio presents Just Plain Theology from Rome, Sweet Rome, featuring Natalia Eugen. So let's go right to Rome, and here's Natalia.
Hey, Bob, how are you? Happy Easter?
Good.
Still?
Yeah, to you too.
And so tonight we have a very special guest, my classmate. How did I introduce him to you, Bob? Budding theologian, soon to be ordained, God willing, deacon in September, famous Catholic blogger, and all-around possible Catholic media mogul one day, Joe Heschmeyer.
You're much too kind, but thanks for having me on. Happy Easter. It's good to be here.
Thanks for being here, Joe. So, Joe, tell us a little bit about yourself. So you are from Kansas City originally, and you are, so you're here studying in Rome. You're going to be, God willing, ordained a deacon in September with that group. And so that's going to be an incredible experience for you. I think coming here probably was too. Had you ever been to Europe before coming to study?
I had, actually. At the end of my senior year of college, I went on a Road to Reformation trip with my Protestant history professor, who took us to the major sites, both Catholic and Protestant. So we actually saw the Vatican, and we saw Assisi, as well as Wittenberg, Germany, where Luther was, Geneva, where Calvin was. And then also Berlin, just because we needed one more stop on the trip.
Okay, so actually I want to go back to that. That's going to be interesting. I've just got a question in my head about that. But we'll go back to your beginnings. And so you were cradle Catholic, right?
Yes. Okay,
but you have an interesting formation background in spite of that. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I was born in the mid-'80s, which were not the golden years of Catholic catechesis in the U.S. or maybe anywhere. And so we grew up going to Mass every Sunday and believing that it was important to be Catholic. But my parents hadn't gotten the greatest catechesis. And so they had really tried their best to kind of fill that in. At the time, I don't think Catholic radio existed in Kansas City. But there were Protestant radio stations. They had good music, and they had really interesting preachers and everything else. And so we got very involved with, evangelical radio, basically. And so every day when my parents would pick me up at school, we'd be listening to that on the way home. They had a lot of children's programming. And so it was very formative throughout most of my childhood.
What did you like best about it, and what has stayed with you most from that experience?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say that there is a really open love of Jesus and of the Bible. Sometimes I think we Catholics can be a little antsy because we know we're not experts. We're always thinking someone else knows the Bible better than I do. And so we use it as an excuse not to talk about the Bible, or maybe even not to read it because, we're not going to understand it on our end. And Protestants don't have that hang up for the most part. And so they're able to just dive in and do their best to understand it. Now, to be sure, sometimes that goes off the rails. Sometimes people have a crazy misunderstanding. But as long as you're open to correction, as long as you're open to having someone who is orthodox and maybe better prepared to answer these things, correct you from time to time, getting in there and reading it is so crucial. St. Jerome said that ignorance of the Scriptures is ignorance of Christ. Mm-hmm. And I think that this is one area where a lot of Catholics are still falling behind a lot of Protestants.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. That's true. And the danger, of course, comes in where you're thinking that what you're getting from this personally is the interpretation, necessarily. And you don't have any recourse to the tradition that the Catholics have. I mean, the Protestants, but a lot of Catholics don't partake of that either. They think that it's inaccessible, and it's not. The writings of the Fathers really aren't, not at all. But that's it. Okay, so you've got a love of Scripture through them. From that formation, and so that stayed with you.
I think that it really is kind of the answer to both halves of that question. It's the thing that I think is most impressive. Mm-hmm. Also a real sense of kind of boldness of being able to say hey, I love Jesus, and this is the most important part of my life, and I love you, and I want you to share in this, and so let me tell you about Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I think, again, this is an area where a lot of, especially, many Catholic communities in the U.S. are descended from like ethnic Catholic communities where they were struggling to fit in the first place. So the idea of going up and being like, hey, why don't you become Catholic, to their Protestant neighbors who already viewed them with a lot of suspicion, was something we've kind of had a lot of trepidation and wariness of, much less going to like the non-Catholic down the block and saying like, do you know that Jesus is the Savior of the universe? You know, like, those conversations, and they're frightening conversations. So seeing people who are willing to kind of take the leap and face rejection, I think it's commendable.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing. You mentioned how a lot of the Catholic churches, they grew up along ethnic lines in the United States. Those ethnicities from Europe have a certain reserve culturally. And it just goes against the grain to go out of your way to talk to someone who isn't part of your group. And it would seem to them that you were really making assumptions about their beliefs and stuff that may not be true, rather than just having a different kind of conversation where just see where they're at. You know, that sort of the idea of going up is just, Ukrainian Catholic churches don't do that sort of thing. You know, you just never grew up thinking that. But you wouldn't necessarily speak that way with another Catholic. The Latin rite for us, for example, or if you were in a Catholic that had traditionally been German, and you wouldn't necessarily go up to the Italians and start talking about Jesus in Scripture. It just wouldn't happen. Today, though, that's the whole, everything's changed. It's very different. So it's more normal to do that. We've had a lot of well-known converts from Protestantism who brought that boldness with them. So yeah, I can see for that. It's a help. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. So how long that you were educated in that kind of Protestant?
So, yeah, I was going to Catholic school, but
you were?
yes, for part of the time. I went to Catholic school until 4th grade, was homeschooled from 4th to 6th, and then 7th and 8th through senior year, I was back in Catholic school.
How did you deal with the change, both going into homeschooling and then coming back out of homeschool?
You know, I think it was a good change in both directions, honestly. I needed it sort of academically to get a little more advanced than I was getting in school. I think I was getting bored in a lot of what I was doing. But then going back into middle school and like being kind of re-socialized was, I think, really good as well. So I didn't kind of go too much into my own sort of internal world exclusively. For 6th grade, for part of that time, I was actually going to a part-time homeschool quasi-school that was evangelical run. So that was like my most I guess, deeply rooted kind of immersion in evangelical. That was the only non-Protestant at the school, I'm sure. So.
And from there, you went to college to Georgetown?
Actually, I went to Washburn first. I went to Georgetown for law school. I went to Washburn for my undergraduate.
Okay. You studied history undergrad. And did you always have that love of history through school, or is that something you just sort of picked up as you were taking?
You know, I remember like enjoying history class in high school, and so I originally thought about going into pre-law when I entered college, but my pre-law advisor said, do what you love. And so history and political science jumped out. My first day of class, in history class, we talked about the Columbian Exchange, you know, like the things that went between the New World and Old World. And my professor had actually made a mistake, and so I went up and approached him about it after the class, and he took me under his wing. He was so pleased that I came to him and like approached him about this, about whether or not potatoes had come to the Old World from the New World or not. That he then moved me into his 300-level class, and was just like I was his first advisory. He'd just gotten into school, and so it was an amazing experience. Like he really just made it all personal. And so he took care of my schedule.
That's nice. You don't often get that.
Yes,
no. Sure. No, so that's great. Oh, okay. And then you went into law in Georgetown. And but you debated in high school and then in college, right? I did. So that's what appealed to you about studying law, wasn't it? Was being a lawyer and litigating, as opposed to just necessarily the stuff behind the scenes.
Yeah, the paperwork did not have any appeal for me. Kind of crafting and producing persuasive arguments was exactly what was appealing.
Yeah. And so you did, so you studied that, and all along the way, how were you in terms of practicing the faith? Like this idea of, being called to the priesthood, had that entered into your mind at that point, or were you doing something else?
I was very much doing something else. From the time I was a kid, I wanted to be a husband and father. And I didn't know really any priests very well growing up. Like, I knew the names of the parish priests, but other than maybe once or twice we had the priests over, we didn't really have any really deep kind of encounters with it. So I wouldn't describe myself as being exposed to it enough that it was on my radar. My dad was good friends with a married deacon, and so I thought that was a good idea because it seemed like the best of both worlds. I also wanted to be a Messianic Jew when I was a kid because we would celebrate Hanukkah and Christmas. So this was not like vocational discernment. This was just me being crafty as a little kid. But even that suggests that I was already seeing something very appealing about being at the altar and being able to preach and all of that.
And that this love for debate and litigation works into this.
Yeah, absolutely. Grace built on nature. So my parents really instilled the love of Jesus in us and a love of the Eucharist. But like I said, some of the finer details of Catholic catechesis were more or less lost on us. And so I had this sense that the church just kind of had a bunch of arbitrary rules. And there were a lot of rules I didn't even know about. So I knew you could go on Saturday night if you couldn't go to Mass on Sunday. I also thought you could go on Monday. So occasionally, based on scheduling things, if I had a debate tournament, I would just go to Mass on Monday thinking I was fulfilling my Sunday obligation. So that level of catechesis is kind of where I'm at in this. I was not a model Catholic in college, but I always had this kind of connection to the faith. And my freshman year, one of the seniors, who was actually the RA on my floor, was I had another debater who I knew very well. I actually grew up with Andrew Strobel, now Father Andrew Strobel. And so we used to drive from Kansas City to Topeka, where the school is, about 75 minutes. And along the way, I would just pepper him with questions. And kind of rudely and aggressively, because we're both debaters, and, I was kind of an insolent 18-year-old. So I'd be like, come on, what is the deal with the church's rule on, birth control, or you name it? And just had no thought of, it could actually be something logical. And every time he responded in a really winsome, logical way, where I had to be like, okay, even if I'm not personally persuaded by that, I can at least see why you might think that. And after it got to be that, every teaching we talked about, I had to at least concede that much, I started to be like, wow, this as an intellectual system, the pieces fit together really well. So there was kind of an intellectual conversion. And so that laid the foundation a few years later for a much deeper conversion of heart, where the kind of still there on a string relationship with Jesus, plus the intellectual stuff, plus coming to realize, I need to take this all more seriously, really led to an outpouring of grace in my life. So
that change that was effected, though, intellectually you could see how it all worked, but it was something else that got you to change behavior, as it were.
There were a few things that got me to change behavior.
You tell.
Yes. So one of them, I used to read just all the time during my lunch hour. So I would be working at the law firm, and this is before I was a lawyer. I was still a records clerk.
What years?
This is right after college, right before law school. So I'm 22 years old, and I have a great job that more than pays the bills and isn't too demanding. And over lunch, I go to the local Barnes & Noble, and I sit in the cafe. I buy a couple treats, and then I just grab some random book off the bookshelf and just read it for the hour and then put it back, which is not at all what I think Barnes & Noble wants you to do. And I would just grab the case. I grabbed the Bhagavad Gita, and most of the time it's just some secular book. One time I grabbed Father Richard John Newhouse's book, Catholic Matters, and it was positively life-changing because he described Catholicism in this way that just kind of brought it to life. And I just got really excited. I went and purchased the book. I didn't just put it back on the shelf. And I remember just being really profoundly touched by it. Strangely, also, the poetry of Leonard Cohen, who wasn't even Christian. He was Jewish but had a real love for Jesus.
Oh, that's right. I remember you telling me you like poetry, and even it surprises even you.
But the way he has a poem for Wilson, His House, where he talks about Christ being pinned like a butterfly against the wood. And the way he described it just was really moving. And it was really painful to read. And then the third was actually a relationship. I was so pretty aggressively pursuing the married vocation.
I love that description. Very nice approach. Okay, go ahead.
And a sweet Protestant girl that I'd gone to college with and who I knew was coming out to D.C. And so, we'd be on the phone for hours and we would talk about religious issues. And she was very much practicing Assemblies of God, Pentecostal, Protestant. And so we'd get into these kind of theological discussions. And she'd be like, okay, I can definitely see where you're coming from with this. And at one point she's like, why don't you live this better?
She said that.
Yes.
I love it. That's hysterical.
And so it was a life-changing moment because I had to be like, wow, yeah, I know this stuff. I clearly know, intellectual truth of this, but I'm not really living it like I ought to be.
I had a moment like that once too. That made me end up going back to church. Intellectually, I got everything, and I could argue better than someone who was actually going to church about why they should go to church. And so finally someone had just asked, well, so what about a mass? All right, I'll go. I was like, well, I guess that's going to change, So, I know what you mean by that.
Yeah, it's a very humbling experience.
It is being convicted like that, but really in the face of that truth, you can do nothing but then do what you have to do. To me, that was very clear. I had no struggle after that at all. So, okay, I see. It was just, and it's funny how that works. Anyway.
He lets us argue ourselves into the church and all that.
He does. Yeah. That's right. I agree.
So she would later say, I made her Catholic and she made me Christian.
And so then you started becoming more serious about that based on her.
Yeah, her and the books, and it's
and all that.
I started to read Catholic stuff left and right pretty much after.
So when you say you became more serious about it, what does that mean? How did that
making sure I was living by the moral law of the church, going to mass more often, and just thinking and praying about it much more than I had been before. Catholicism was always close to the forefront of my mind, even when I wasn't really kind of living according to it. I was so intrigued by it that I wanted to talk to people about it all the time. But I think the kind of interior contradiction between speaking like Catholicism is true and living like it's not, it had to break one way or the other. Yeah. And by the grace of God, it broke in the right direction.
When you started, so you started living the faith more. Was it at that point that you started discerning the priesthood, or did that happen afterwards?
That was actually well afterwards.
Oh, okay.
So this was right before I entered law school. That this kind of, and it was kind of ongoing. So it was about a year process, I would say. Senior year of college, I didn't look very devout, particularly probably. By the end of my first year of law school, I'm going to daily mass. And so somewhere in there are a lot of small steps, but small steps in one direction.
Right. And when did you start discerning?
So that wasn't until after I graduated law school. So the girl I mentioned before, I actually dated her throughout all of law school. And she said, I won't marry you until you're out of law school. Okay. So I get out of law school, take the bar, pass, and so I finally got a job, and I'm kind of on my feet, and I'm starting to take more serious, we're looking at wedding venues and these sorts of things, and suddenly everyone starts to ask me, why aren't you considering the priesthood? So by this point, I had started Shameless Popery, my blog, and so some of the people asking me are just people who I literally do not know, who are just emailing me to say, hey, why aren't you a priest? And that's a weird question to email a stranger about, I think, even.
Well, yes and no, but that must have struck me, though, because they're looking at this from a distance. And so they don't know you at all.
Yeah.
So they're seeing something that those close to you may not, that you yourself may not have seen, and you thought, what are, in their mirror, to me, I'm looking at myself. What is this about myself that they've seen I haven't considered?
Yeah, initially I was very dismissive of it. I thought, okay, they just figure I'm good at theology, therefore I must be holy, therefore I must be called to the priesthood. And you just can't go from A to B to C like that. Because it's quite possible for one and not the other two of those to be true. Well, eventually the still Protestant mother of the girl I'm dating starts to ask her daughter why I'm not considering the priesthood. And that was positively alarming.
Oh, dear.
So at that point, I go to the parish priest. I'm in a men's group, and I mention it sort of nonchalantly, kind of minimizing it. And he's like, Joe, you can't minimize this. He then tells me the story of St. Ambrose, who, as governor of Milan, went and put down a riot between the Christians and one of the heretical sects over who the next bishop would be. And they start chanting for him to become the bishop. And his point was not, you're going to be a catechumen who then becomes the bishop, right? Because at the time, Ambrose wasn't even baptized.
Right.
His point was that, like, sometimes when the Holy Spirit can't work through you, he'll just work around you. And that seemed to be what was going on here. So from the time I was in 7th grade, I'd wanted to be a lawyer. And I had natural skills that seemed like a good fit for it. And so I would pray, but the prayers I was praying were just like, Lord, I really want to do this. Please open these doors for me. And he would, and so I assumed it was his will. And so the discernment process really started when I became sort of starkly aware that at no point had I just stopped and said, God, what is your will for my life? And as I started to ask that question and stopped trying to put him on my timetable and waited on him, it turned out he and I had different plans, so we're doing it his way.
Was it difficult to hand over the reins?
Oh, yeah. Much more than I thought it would be. Because I thought that I had handed over the reins. I thought that I was like letting him be in control. And I also thought that I was totally flexible to whatever God wanted. Because obviously, he knows everything. He knows me better than I know myself, and he loves me more than I love myself. So his plan is going to be better than my plan. Intellectually, no doubt. Right. But in practice, handing over the reins. And I wish I could say, oh, once discernment ended and I knew I was called to the priesthood, I never tried to take the reins back. But it's a daily
hourly
struggle.
Sometimes. No, you're kidding. That might end maybe 15 minutes after you're dead. I'm not
Exactly.
When did you realize that you had not abandoned yourself, even to the degree you thought you had?
So I started discerning in May of 2012. I'm sorry, May of 2011. And so from May until mid-September, there was kind of this ongoing process of seeing deeper and deeper that way I was still holding on to things. For example, I put the relationship on hold and said, I'll have an answer for you by the 4th of July, which turned out I didn't because I was still trying to put God on the timetable. And so that was one of the kind of concrete instances of me thinking like, okay, I'll just be totally passive, God will give me an answer by this date, and then we'll move on.
Yeah, but you picked that date, and
right.
So you worked into your schedule that day, and
right.
Well, okay. So he didn't answer you by then.
Right, exactly.
So you had to go empty-handed, as it were, to this young lady and say, I don't know.
Yeah, we had a series of conversations. So my spiritual director told me to put the relationship, to go on a dating test, what he said.
Yeah.
And I took this extremely literally. In hindsight, clearly not what he meant. But I put the relationship on hold, except for Sundays and solemnities. And we'd still we'd go to mass together, and then we'd go and have a meal together. And at these meals, we would talk about where things stood. And I remember at one point saying there was like a 30% chance I might be called to seminary, and then 50% chance the second time, and the third time I was like, I don't really want to put a number on it. So there was clearly a progress kind of going there.
Okay, so that's how that works with you. They're gradually, but in clear stages with a clear increase in either interest or sense of being drawn or called to something. Okay.
Yeah, so he very gently kind of pulled me along.
Yeah. And so you then entered?
So then I actually had to, break off the relationship in mid-September.
Was that hard? I mean, did
she was saintly about it.
Yeah.
And she did know it was coming.
Yeah.
So, back in May, when I first realized, maybe I should wait to get an engagement ring because there's this new issue on the horizon, we had a couple of really good talks about it. And she said, look, if you're called to the priesthood, it'll be like you died and went to heaven. I'll be sad at the loss, but I'll be so happy for you. Yeah. And so it was like one of the real prayers in my heart was like, Lord, if I do this, you need to take care of her, because I don't want to have this horrible guilt of knowing that I've really hurt her, and if things didn't work out for her vocation after that or something, I would have a real guilt with it. So flash forward to mid-September when I actually have to have this conversation. She had been in Lourdes, and while in Lourdes, had gotten a real sense that the day after she got back, we were going to break up. And I didn't know this until I went over the day after she got back. And she met me at the door and said, "Are we breaking up?" And I said, "Yes, let's go for a walk." And so it was incredibly beautiful. It was all the closure either of us needed, and then we prayed together, and then I walked her home, and that was that.
No.
And I emailed the vocation director that night and said, "I think I might be called to seminary." So yeah, that was kind of the way that worked. There was kind of a nice epilogue to this. There was a young man who I met through kind of a couple that we were friends with, who I tried briefly to kind of convert to Catholicism. He was dealing with some issues of faith and reason, but we were like, the group of us were out at a bar. It was too noisy to really have a good kind of deep conversation, and so it didn't really go as well as I'd hoped. Well, she kept in touch with him afterwards and converted him to Catholicism, and then married him, and they now have 2 beautiful young daughters, of whom I'm the godfather. So,
oh, what a beautiful ending.
Yeah.
There you go. So then you enter the seminary, and how did you find that life? That was very different from what you were used to.
It was pretty different from what I was used to. I actually found that I loved it. I was nervous coming in because I knew I was going to be older than some of the guys. You know, I was 27 when I entered, and I'll be 33 when I get ordained. And so there was this sense of like, okay, you got guys who, by the time they're 18, they already know. And so they're going in, and they're entering theology by 22 and getting ordained by 25, and I'm already past that age. So I'm in a pre-theology program. So pre-theology is for people who already have a college degree. It's a 2-year kind of fast-track program to get another bachelor's degree. So I actually am moving in the wrong direction degree-wise. I went from getting undergrad to graduate back to undergraduate degrees.
Handing over those reins again.
Yes, exactly. But I was in a community of just 12 pre-theologians in a broader seminary. Just an amazing community of guys.
That's nice, that's small. That doesn't always happen.
Yeah, it's a broader, like 12 guys in my class from my pre-theology class. And from all different walks of life, all different backgrounds. And holy guys who cared about their brothers and were good about holding each other accountable. But we're still part of a broader community, so it didn't get too claustrophobic. And the philosophy at Kenrick Glennon, I think is, if not unparalleled, at least like in the upper echelon of what you can find in any seminary. Like the level of philosophy there, it's just outstanding. And I think it shows the guys we have here at the NAC who went to Kenrick, I think have extremely good philosophy and can talk cogently on Aristotle and Thomas, you know, and they know the philosophical underpinnings of things related to the human person and related to the faith. And that might sound irrelevant, but
oh no, it's not. I know I still am amazed that there are people who think that's true, but there are a lot of theologians in the United States. I mean, I've had some who were, well, in other places I've said, not here, but I mean, who come from that mindset, and so they've gone through all kinds of theological education in various places with no philosophy whatsoever, and you get lost. You just don't have the tools to make the world is unintelligible without it. I mean, and certainly you can't make sense of Revelation in any way, insofar as we're able, you know, because it is outside of us. But I mean, without that, it's impossible. So had you studied philosophy before? Or
no.
Not?
And so I was very much like in this category of people who like knew theology pretty well, but was just like woefully underinformed philosophically.
What did you like best about philosophy classes?
Well, that's a good question.
I know when I started studying them, I loved metaphysics. I absolutely loved it. It just gave bones to some theological concepts that you need. You know, again, great building on nature, you can see how Revelation is intelligible because of the metaphysical structure that is intelligible to us, that we get. You know, we can see it. It's just part of us and our existence and. I would point to, I guess, 3 different areas, metaphysics being one of them. And I didn't find it the most fun class. It's very complex, and sometimes you just feel like you were swimming because, you know, a lot of really fine detail. When you have that in place, you have the metaphysical foundation, everything else falls together. It's true, yeah.
And then political philosophy was one kind of, it's basically a self-contained unit. You know, when you talk about like anthropology and all these other areas, they're so interconnected with the other disciplines. Political philosophy is a little more on its own, so it's more manageable. And it changes the way you view the Catholic's relationship to the state and the role of the state. So, take an easy example. Christ says, no man can serve two masters. But then he also says, render unto Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and unto God what belongs to God. So you ask yourself, how isn't that serving two masters?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Well, before Pilate, he says, you'd have no power unless it came to you from on high. And so St. Peter is able to talk about how we serve the emperor because we serve God. And this notion of all legitimate civil authority being rooted in divine power in some way, and that then set the demarcation lines. So Augustine and Aquinas and Martin Luther King are all fond of this phrase that an unjust law is no law at all. That's not just lofty rhetoric. Literally, if you know what a law is, it can't be outside of the authority you've been delegated. In the same way that, coming from a legal background, if you sit your lawyer in to settle a case between $5,000 and $10,000, and he opens up with a $20,000 offer, he doesn't have the authority to do that.
Right.
So the offer's no good. Because you didn't give him, if you've given him explicit written permission to do this and this, and he tries something else. So too, when the state acts outside of the authorities been given by God, it doesn't act as a state.
Right.
So that was kind of a cool insight from political philosophy. The third class I point to is Elizabeth Anscombe. We had an entire class just on her philosophy. She does a lot with action theory and a lot of kind of nuanced fields. But one of the things that we saw is the way that most secular philosophy had just really failed to even ask the right questions. And so it was all some form of basically what she called consequentialism. And so you would have these philosophers who were convinced that there was no such thing as an intrinsically evil act. So torturing a child is wrong most of the time. But if you have enough things on the other side of the scale, that, if you could save 1 million lives by torturing a child, you should probably torture the child. That sort of philosophy is virtually universal right now.
That's true.
And so she really charted this course saying, in part, we don't even have the right to talk about right and wrong, because we don't mean by that what anyone who used that term prior to the 18th century meant by it. And so, good and evil, all of these terms no longer mean what ordinary people mean by them and what people historically meant by them in this special academic use.
I'm sure you found this when you're blogging and you're having discussions with people who have comments on there, that you constantly have to define terms. And even if you do it in what you're writing, I imagine that someone's reading it and they're not necessarily taking what you've written down as the term, perhaps you defined it explicitly or not. But they've got their own idea, and you're starting off not using necessarily the same vocabulary, or if you are using the same word, certainly not meaning the same thing. What a pain in the neck, you have to start from scratch so often. It's very time-consuming.
Absolutely. Matter is a good one. When an Aristotelian says form and matter, they don't mean the same thing that a Darwinian means by matter, or even that a modern scientist in general means by material world. We mean different things in some sometimes subtle ways. And if you confuse those two things, you will come to a wrong conclusion. The whole debate over gay marriage had one entire side of the argument refusing to say what they meant by marriage. Just saying, well, whatever marriage is, it ought to be open to people of the same sex. Which is like saying, whatever a square is, it ought to be open to three-sided objects.
Right. It's just, illogical.
But it's only clear that it's illogical if you define terms.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so you find yourself really liking philosophy.
I love it.
which is good as you came. And then so then you finished up there, and then you came to Rome, and you started here. And what was that like going? What was that like for you coming here to Rome and living in the chaos? Well, here you still have chaos because you do have to leave the walls of the neck. Everything here is very orderly. You've got these right angles everywhere. It's pretty different than St. Louis, and I traveled a fair amount before I entered seminary. I loved to travel. I had been to Ireland, to Japan, and then the European trip that I mentioned to you earlier. And so it was really exciting to know I'm going to be in Italy, and there's so many opportunities here. There's so many great religious sites, and travel is so cheap compared to in the U.S. If I want to get on a plane from here to London round trip, I can find it for $100 or less. Living in bear in mind, I'm from Kansas City, which I know St. Louis is in a similar situation, where if you want to go virtually anywhere, it's
quite a drive or a flight, and often a pretty expensive flight.
Yeah. Yeah, we forget. The States is so big, Here, I'm amazed you can just hop on a train and go someplace. I mean, I remember going to Viterbo and going to some other places. And it's so close, and all the history that's there. And you're thinking, why am I, or CC. I mean, I remember going there to CC. I went there twice, and I thought, it's so close. And I never thought I'd get here. I thought, wow, people here, anytime it's an hour and a half. Oh, boy, there's so many distractions. Oh, and so how do you keep yourself disciplined with your studies and all
I wish I knew. And I think being mindful of why I'm here. I'm not just here to go on trips. And the NAC is actually good about having sort of structured time in which there's basically 1 weekend a month we're allowed to travel. And so it makes sure that you don't have just like constant wanderlust. And, back in the old days, the guys would be here, and oftentimes they wouldn't be allowed to leave the house, or leave the city anyway. And to be in Europe knowing I'm never going to have an opportunity to see these places again, to be so close and be told you can't go to them would be maddening.
Yeah.
And so they do a good job of letting it kind of get out of our system a little bit, indulging it in kind of weekend trips once a month. And that leaves you a little more free the rest of the time.
You need some recreation also that way.
Yeah.
Just to take a break from the studies. And sometimes physically leaving where you're living is a great way to do that. You really do come back refreshed. And sometimes it's an adventure, too. That's why in transportation people. That was great. I wanted to ask you about the trip that you had taken with your history professor here. And now, you don't often hear about pilgrimages. Well, I don't know if he considered it a pilgrimage.
It wasn't like officially a pilgrimage. It was through the school, but it was pretty obviously places he wanted to see.
So for you as a Catholic sites clearly could have been on a personal level of pilgrimage. So that was one thing. But it's interesting to have been able to go to those sites, but as well as to the Protestant ones. Because I don't think most Catholics get to them to see them for that reason, to see historically, where the Reformation happened and where Luther was, or Calvin was. I mean, how did you experience that?
I thought it was fascinating. So it was, I guess, two things jumped out. I was really reminded of how monastic Luther was. So you go and it's like visiting something monastic. And you can see, even like in Wittenberg and, where he is kind of housed and I don't know, so there was that dimension. That's one of the things that jumped out. Actually, another thing that jumped out, the church in Wittenberg is a really sad history with what's called the Udensau. Prior to the Reformation, the Catholics had carved an anti-Semitic image on the outside of a Jewish man sucking at the teat of a pig, just to mock their Jewish neighbors. After the Reformation, the Lutherans took over this is called the town church. They took over the church and they added the holy name for God above it, the name unspeakable by the Jews, which takes this anti-Semitic insult to a new level and insults God in the process. On the outside of the church, and it's still there. There was a petition after World War II to remove it, but ultimately I think the Jewish community said no. It's important that people know that this existed. Let's not whitewash this history. So there's a little memorial there. But that was a real eye-opening moment of just kind of an ugly period of the history of the church. And an ugly period both for Catholicism and Protestantism. Frankly, Luther's history with Jewish people is not a positive one. On a lighter note, when I was in Geneva, there was what's called the Reformation Wall, or the Wall of Reformers. So it's these gigantic statues of John Calvin, Philip Melanchthon, Theodore Beza, and the fourth, I'm not remembering who. But I thought it was just hilarious that there were these giant graven images to
I was just thinking the same thing. You got these people with iconoclasm, in their thinking, and
they're being held up precisely because they're viewed as kind of model Christians. This is where saint statues come from.
Right. You're doing exactly what you're really getting.
And you're showing how natural it is to have statues of the saints. Right.
That's a great argument. I mean, I'm sure you've used that with people. So you're still blogging, and you don't sleep, so you can do this later. That's okay. And what are some of the topics? Okay, so you've been doing it for about 7 years, and how has that changed for you? Have the topics that have been most interesting to you changed as time has gone by because you've either gotten out of the system, or you're just done arguing with them, or?
Yeah, that's a good question. There have definitely been changes. I think I'm more tied to the liturgical year now than I was when I first started out. And so I'm a little more likely to do either theological reflections or apologetics related to the cycle of readings. Whereas before, it was more related to like things I was newly discovering with what I was reading. So I would pick up some book, I would devour it, and then for the next 3 weeks, it'd be very much on my mind. I'd write a ton about it. And so I'd try to space out the posts. I wasn't just only writing about that particular thing. I think also some of the people that I have in view, I went from early on mostly focusing on people who were pretty adversarial to Catholicism and showing why they were wrong, to maybe reaching more towards Protestants who just don't really know. I mean, a lot of Protestants say, yeah, it's really interesting this thing you've got about the saints, but I've got no background. And it's a big thing to just say, oh, you should join me for the rosary then. To really kind of like meet people who are maybe a little more open-minded and focus on that, I think hopefully it's been a little, I don't think it was ever particularly adversarial, but occasionally the kind of background and litigation will come forth in a more of a negative way. And I've been trying to kind of work on that too.
That was my other question. Going to be, has your approach changed in how you've come to the post and how you've been writing and who you have in mind who you're talking to?
Yeah. So the reason the blog started was originally because I was so annoying to my Protestant friends. And I knew this was happening, and I couldn't stop. Like, every time we would talk, I'd be like, oh, I just learned this cool thing about, like, papal infallibility. And they'd be like, stop. And so eventually I had to just, like, get a blog so I would have an outlet to just, like, pour all of this information so as not to, like, burn 100 bridges, you know. And so it just to, like, make it, honestly, I thought, this way, if they want to read this stuff, they can. They know I'm writing about it. And it won't be in their face. They can kind of choose to do it on their terms. And then it turned out other people liked it besides just like my immediate friends. And so I just continued to write. I never really did much to advertise, particularly in the early days. It was just, I figured I'd write and write and write until I ran out, and then I would stop.
Yeah.
And I just haven't really hit that wall yet.
And why the name?
Oh, yes. So I was really struggling with the name for the blog. So I was like, Catholicism Contra Mundum, Catholic Defense, like all these other things, and they all seemed too overwrought in sort of like, I don't know, they were just too much. And so I turned to my friend Don, who is a Reformed Protestant, and I'm like, I need a name for my new Catholic blog. And he says, without missing a beat, Shameless Popery.
That's very cool.
And he says it like tongue-in-cheek, and I'm like, no, that's perfect. Because it's got a levity to it that, you know, it says two things, hopefully. Yes, this is a Catholic blog, and like unabashedly so. And two, like, it doesn't take itself overly seriously. It doesn't take itself too seriously. You know, like there was a blog post once on how Aquinas might respond to a zombie uprising. Like, hopefully, you know, sharing little bits of the faith, but in kind of a fun way from time to time.
What's your favorite theological topic these days?
That's a good question. I think that the Eucharist is always kind of, I always want to talk about the Eucharist. And someone just had a point where I'm just like, okay, you can't just write every blog post about the Eucharist. The nature of the church is something that I increasingly think is the debate we're not having but ought to be having. In terms of what? So, yeah, the Reformation, before indulgences, is already brewing because of a controversy over what it means to be the church founded by Christ. So Jan Hus is the one who really gets this going, and John Wycliffe in England. And both of them argue explicitly that the church, in the true sense of church, is only the collection of the saved. And they're seeing in their world bad priests, bad bishops. And at the time, they did a very kind of clericalist understanding that, you know, the church is the Pope, the bishops, and the priests. And, like, I don't know, maybe the deacons and subdeacons. And so there's not a full sense of what Vatican II looks like about the whole people of God being the church. That's still, I mean, the church still teaches that at the time, but certainly the ordinary person's understanding is much more, you are the church if you work in the church. And you're up on the altar, and you're allowed to touch the holy objects. Otherwise, you're just like a normal person. So in response to an already kind of bad vision of the church, Huss and Wycliffe present a different, also bad vision of the church, in which like bad bishops aren't part of the church. And so Wycliffe will explicitly argue that Judas was a bishop and an apostle, but not a member of the church. And as an ecclesiology, it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Like St. Paul explicitly talks in 1 Corinthians about how of those appointed within the church, the body of Christ, first and foremost are the apostles. And then he goes from there.
Mm-hmm.
And so the apostles are by definition within the church founded by Christ. And Judas is called by Christ. Jesus says as much in John 6. He says, "Did I not call you 12 and one of you is a devil?"
Mm-hmm. And
so if you really get into the ecclesiology, you start to see a few things. One, the church isn't just a collection of the saved. In Matthew 13, Jesus compares it to a net containing both good and bad fish. And he describes it as the kingdom of heaven. So the church is the kingdom of heaven, but not in a utopian sense, where there's no bad people in it, or else we wouldn't be in it. Like if there's no sinners, then you might as well just close up shop. He came not to call the righteous sinners. And so you start to see there's room for the wicked within the church. You start to see that not everyone within the church will be saved, apparently. And you start to see that like the laity are called to a very particular role within the church as well. And so my pre-seminary formation was at mostly the Catholic Information Center in Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's run by Opus Dei. So very much like you get a lot of this Jose Maria, everyone is called to be a saint kind of spirituality, which is great. My favorite spiritual author is Francis de Sales, who's all about the exact same thing.
Absolutely. He was certainly ahead of his time when he talked about, especially in Introduction to the Devout Life. And he's speaking to lay people in that directly.
A laywoman working in the courts.
And it's just, you just don't see that in the spiritual literature coming out of that time period.
Yeah.
Everything is from clerics to religious, if you're going to find that kind of correspondence, usually. I mean, I'm sure there's this other stuff, but not so well known, but he's incredible that way. His approach was, outstanding. It's a real model for how to, I think it's that book is really good for lay people to start with, to read spiritually, very much so. And so, I was going to ask you another question about that, the theology part of it. So you're looking at this from, I know what I was going to say. When you talk about Wycliffe, I remember doing some reading about him and his understanding. He already had problems with authority in the church, transubstantiation, and all that. Where do you see that coming first? Was the problem first with the authority or in this lack of faith in the Eucharist? Did that come out of this bad example he'd seen around him? Because that was there, like you said, it was already growing a couple of hundred years before.
Yeah, I don't know enough about the details of Wycliffe's kind of own journey, so to speak. But I think the two go hand in glove. So, for example, when Luther first had a problem with indulgences, he writes a beautiful letter to the Pope saying, "You're the true vicar of Christ on earth. I want you to adjudicate this controversy, and I promise to abide by whatever you decide." But he doesn't immediately get an answer in his favor. Within a year or so, he starts openly ruminating about whether or not the Pope's not actually the Antichrist. That's a pretty fast turnaround.
Yep.
I think it's 1517 to 1518. And I'm going off of memory, I may be getting some of the details wrong here, but basically you see this throughout the history of the church. You'll see people writing from the East to the Pope saying, "We know you're the head of the church. Please settle this controversy." And then when the Pope settles the controversy, the losing side's like, "You don't have any authority over us, we're in the East." Or, "You don't have any authority over us, you're the Antichrist," in the later case of the Protestants. And so it's just, usually I think the cycle is something like this. You get some theological or moral problem that arises. Then you have the authority step in a way that people don't like, and then you have a problem with authority. If the authorities had decided in your favor, you wouldn't have a problem with authority. And so all of the stuff that Luther writes, Babylonian captivity and everything written against the Pope, it's after he gets a negative response from Rome.
Yeah. And then it always ends up coming down you have, like you said, the problem with the authority, but then that's when the doctrines are starting to get questioned. It's not the other way around.
Yeah, I think we're seeing this, to be quite frank with you, in a lot of places right now in the American Catholic Church, where people won't like what the Pope's done, so they'll start to say, well, is he even really the Pope? And then you start to have an ecclesiological problem. And then, once you go off the rails there's really no stopping. So I was reading about one of these communities where they just elected an anti-pope. And things got crazy very, very quickly. Like the anti-pope had a rule about like not turning your back on the Eucharist. So people were like walking backwards out of the adoration chapel. And just like bizarre stuff.
You get really bizarre stuff when that happens. I knew a community where that was in place. I mean, they were schismatic. I mean, so you can see why that is. I mean, it's a way also not to deal with the difficulties that are involved with having a church with human members that are flawed in themselves, that are in positions of authority legitimately, and may not wield that authority well because of their personal whatever. And so that it can be a real trial of faith to be in a position where you have to accept that and just trust that God will take care of this in His time, rather than just bolting.
In a lot of ways, we're still fighting the Donatist controversy.
Yeah.
The Donatists, they were outraged, and rightly so, that bishops and priests had buckled under persecution during the Diocletian persecution. Some of them had even turned over holy objects. The things that they seemingly accurately accused their priests and bishops of doing are worse than just like having a really irreverent mass, or like having, Marty Hoggins music on the organ or something like that. It's like actual turning over sacred objects to idolaters who are going to like profane and destroy them. And so the people said, how could these be our bishops? How can these be our priests? And the unfortunate answer, more or less, is, well, they are.
They are.
And it's bad, but the alternative is worse. If you don't know who a true bishop or priest is because you never know if someone's privately in sin, that's a worse situation. And so Augustine has a lot of good stuff against it. And so really it's that controversy where we are scandalized by the sins of others. Sometimes justly, sometimes hypocritically.
Right, sometimes there's a lot of scapegoating going on. And it's just easier to look at the sins of others and to look at ourselves also. But at the same time, it gets complicated when there are objective things wrong and things have to be said or talked about, and things just become difficult. I mean, any parish knows this. You always have problems because there's just sin. It's a problem of evil in the world ultimately.
Yeah.
Why is it there to begin with? It's always just very difficult. And you want to find that refuge in the church. You found your way to salvation, anyone who's had a conversion or reversion or whatever. And, you're making this attempt, and then when you see those who are supposed to be perfected, as a bishop is supposed to be, for example, I'm not picking on any particular bishop at all, don't get me wrong, but I mean, someone in authority throughout history, there's always been one because the temptation to corruption of power is always great. So you found the salvation, you're thinking, well, they're supposed to be even better than I am, and they're not. So how is it I can possibly listen to what they're saying? And it takes a great deal of trust to continue on in faith.
Yeah.
And humility, really, because you have to think, well, maybe there, but for the grace of God, go I. We don't know what we would do in that position in the same way, with the same background and all that. But it's difficult. Yeah, especially authority is a big one.
Yeah. We started to talk a minute ago about how these groups, when they go off the rails, when they break communion, almost immediately you start to see everything else kind of become up for grabs. So like Luther didn't originally have a problem with the papacy. He didn't originally have a problem with the sacraments. He didn't originally have most of the problems that he ends up having. Even sola fide is not on his radar until after all of this breaks. And so what he later would view as the defining doctrine of the Reformation, justification by faith alone, that doesn't come until later. All of this happens, and in a way, it's a beautiful homage to the church. Because you start to see that, if I went my own way, I too would have heretical doctrines left and right, like everyone else who has done this. You don't have a lot of cases of people breaking off total communion with the church and just being fine.
Right. I mean, Henry VIII.
Yeah. Defender of the sacraments.
Exactly. And so he didn't get an answer.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's really kind of the classic case.
Yeah.
And it's a short jump from Henry VIII to Queen Elizabeth.
Mm-hmm.
And with Queen Elizabeth, everything has gotten so crazy that, you actually see this transition in the Articles of Faith believed in by the Anglicans. The original articles declare belief in transubstantiation, and the later ones mock it as a superstitious fable. And so it's funny because you literally can't be a good Anglican, because to be an Anglican you have to disagree with one or the other of these sets of articles of faith. Which says something, but neither here nor there. I'm not here to talk about Anglicanism.
We've got 5 minutes left, and I have one question I'd like to close with. On your blog, I was looking through. I was looking to see when it had started. So there were some old posts, and somewhere in the middle, there was one that spoke about the Harvard priest. I don't know if you remember that. Much about what you wrote about that one.
I don't remember much.
But I actually would want to ask you now what you think of. What would you say is the heart of a priest supposed to look like? How do you see yourself living up to that?
Wow, that's probably more than a 5-minute question. The priest, we talk about him as a spiritual father, and he's also a manifestation of Christ. And I think the model for authority in Luke 22, where authority is found in service, means that if the priest is called to serve, they're called to lead, he's called to serve. And he's called to have a heart modeled off of the heart of Jesus. St. John Vianney talks about this. And the heart of Jesus takes on the sins of the world and suffers for them. And so the priest is called to do that in a special way. The Catechism talks about how a priest is encouraged to do penance for his penitents. You should suffer for your children. And you should, not out of a love of suffering as such, but out of love of your children. When they're wounded, when one part of the body suffers, you suffer with it. You don't just kind of go along your uncomfortable way while people are hurting. You're called to enter into that situation with them.
What does that mean for you when you say enter into this situation? I would think that's a tough call. It would have to be on a case by case.
Yeah,
how you do that.
Yeah, I think empathy, prayer. Sometimes you can kind of concretely provide some sort of advice. A lot of times you pray and sacrifice for them, and just you kind of put it in God's hands. That you join your heart to the suffering heart of Christ.
And being open to the sufferings of others, that's something that it's important for people in the parish to know that their priest will not, let's say they go to confession, will not just give them an answer in terms of trying to fix the problem.
Yes.
But it's really going to be receptive to them as a suffering person and able to go along with them to a degree, which is not a comfortable thing to do sometimes. You may not necessarily want to hear this horrible story, and find a way to be empathetic. It's not easy, maybe. I don't know.
Oh, no, you were describing very much. My ongoing area of growth in a lot of ways is not jumping into an immediate problem, solution rather, to someone's problem. Knowing that there are times you just listen, you empathize, and you're just present for them. And, you provide counsel as you can, but a lot of times people aren't coming to you because you have some insights you don't know.
Right.
They're coming to you because they need someone to walk with them as they do the thing they need to do.
And at the same time, they may want an answer, but they're not there yet ready to receive it. They need to get it out. They need someone to hear them, and also maybe just validate what it is that they have to say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes they need to come to the answer themselves, and they can't have it given to them.
Yeah, that's true too. It's going to be wonderful. There you go.
Please pray.
And so September is when you're going to be ordained.
Yeah, September 28th.
Along with the rest of the third tier guys, am I right?
Yeah.
Right, at St. Peter's.
Yeah, St. Peter's.
Very exciting.
Yeah.
That would be wonderful.
Oh, it's going to be great.
Little did you know when you started the blog with that name was Pope, where you'd be in it.
It's true.
There you'd be. That's fantastic. All right. Well, thank you very much, Joe, for being with us.
My pleasure.
We've got a couple of minutes left. I'm wondering if I was going to ask. Well, I think that's too much. I was going to ask you about the faith and reason.
They're both good.
Yeah, there you go. There's the answer.
The two wings by which the human spirit rises.
Exactly. No, the discussions you had with who became Father Strobel, you said.
So the faith and reason discussion was actually with Justin, who ended up marrying my ex-girlfriend.
Oh, okay. I got that one. Okay. Right.
Yeah, my issues beforehand have been on a wide variety of things, but a lot of them theology of the body questions that were answered very beautifully by Father Anderson.
Okay, all right. My bad. I'll have to have you on again sometime. All right. Well, Bob, I think we're out of time pretty much.
Yes, we've been listening to Just Plain Theology from Rome Sweet Home with Natalia Vujian and her guest, Joe Heschmeyer. And all we can say to end is, may God bless each and every one of you. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.